So I'm going to start with a clip from Strangers on a Train just to refresh us a little bit as to kind of where D.A. Miller is coming from. And we'll go from there to talk about that piece. So give me 1 second. Okay, so hopefully everybody sees that. I'll take this down. And let's just watch the clip. Now, this is going to be right at the beginning of the film. And it's really where D.A. Miller notices the book that is being read. Okay, so here we go.
Excuse me.
I beg your pardon. Aren't you Guy Haynes? Oh, sure. I saw you blast Faraday right off the court in South Orange last season. Made the semifinals, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh, I certainly admire people who do things. By the way, my name is Bruno. Bruno Anthony. See? Well, I suppose you think it's corny, but my mother gave it to me, so I have to wear it to please her.
How do you do?
I don't talk much. You go ahead and read.
Thanks.
Now, it must be pretty exciting to be so important.
Tennis player isn't so important.
Oh, but people who do things are important. Now, me, I never seem to do anything. I suppose you're going to Southampton for the doubles.
You are a tennis fan.
Gee, I wish I could be there to watch you. But I've got to get back to Washington tomorrow. I'm from Arlington, you know. Cigarette?
Not now, thanks. I don't smoke much.
Me, I smoke too much.
Oh, here.
Oh, thanks. Oh, elegant. From A to G. I'll bet I can guess who A is.
Yeah?
Ann Norton. You see, sometimes I turn the sports page and I see the society section. And the pictures. She's very beautiful. Senator Morton's daughter, huh?
You're quite a reader, Mr. Anthony.
Yes, I am. Ask me anything. I got the answer. Even news about people I don't know. Like, who would like to marry whom when his wife gets her divorce?
Perhaps you read too much.
Oh, there I go again. Too friendly. Always happens. I meet somebody who I like and admire, and I open my mouth too much.
Okay, so let's talk about that clip just a little bit before diving into Miller and what he says about it. So what is going on in that scene on the level of the plot of the film? And anybody can take this. You can put it in the chat. You can chime in, whatever. I'm just going to jot down a few notes while you're answering.
It's the introduction of like the two main characters.
Yeah. And how do we understand their relationship kind of right off the bat?
Would it be like their like how it started off with showing their feet and then gradually moving up towards the eye contact, and him actually going over to actually have a conversation and creating that dialogue between those two characters?
Okay. And how do we get that set up? And so what about the feet is important? What happens right at the beginning? Do you need to see it again?
The feet initiates the conversation.
Yeah. And did you notice whose foot hits whose?
It was Guy's foot hits Bruno's, but Bruno's the one who actually starts speaking. But
yeah, right. So it's almost like he interprets an invitation to interrupt or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And then so what happens next what's the big thing that D.A. Miller starts to notice in this scene? I'm going to cue it up while y'all answer here. Give me 1 second. What does D.A. Miller notice?
He notices his like face on the book in newspaper.
Okay. Yeah. Let me show you all that shot. Give me 1 second here. Okay. So you're D.A. Miller. You're, half watching a movie you've seen a dozen times on television at night. You see this scene play out at the very beginning of the film. And you notice this. Okay. So I want to show you how long this actually lasts. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so that's it, right? Not very long. Okay, so what does he notice about that book? So it has whose face on it?
Hitchcock.
And why is that important to Miller? What had just happened before this scene?
He saw Hitchcock going up the stairs, I believe.
Yeah, right? Hitchcock gets onto the train and he passes the main character. And what does the main character not notice?
That he's the guy in the book.
Right. So Miller starts with this supposition that like Hitchcock cameos take place in films in which Alfred Hitchcock does not exist. And that's why no one recognizes him in his cameo, right? And yet here we have in this one scene so far, evidence that Hitchcock does exist in the world as a celebrity. And in fact, not only that, but that the main character who just saw him and didn't react to him clearly would know who this person is, right? So what does this get D.A. Miller thinking about in the essay? There's kind of two tracks he follows. One is also foregrounded in this scene, right, where Bruno and Guy are talking, and he mentions that he reads the society pages and he reads the sports page, and then the response after he brings up divorce is perhaps you read too much, okay, which is a signal for kind of what D.A. Miller is actually going to do in this essay, which is read too much into the film, right? Mm-hmm. So this sets up one line of inquiry. What happens when we start to look too much into what a movie is doing? And he's using kind of dual modes of analysis here. One is looking at it through the lens of auteurism, and the other one is doing it through the lens of some of the stuff we talked about in our readings this week and haven't gotten to yet, but through psychoanalytic readings, which brings us to the other strand that he pursues of trying to figure out all of the doubles, right? So if there are double Hitchcocks, who's a double Hitchcock? How many Hitchcocks are there? Do the main characters represent Hitchcock? Which characters represent different elements of Hitchcock? Does this happen in other films of Hitchcock's, right? So where does he end up taking all of this? In your opinion, this is what I'm asking you. You don't have to like tell me exactly. I mean, what did you think of how he's going about analyzing this film?
So at one point in the essay, you mentioned it already that he was reading too closely.
Mm-hmm.
I think his essay read like he was reading too closely into it, because ultimately the Hitchcock appearances that he's making reference to, they have nothing definitively to do with the story. And then he tries to make, does it have any of his appearances in the film? Does it have any relationship to his other appearance in other films? And I'm like, I don't think so, but.
Right. And yet, as he points out, like they clearly do exist, right? And we know that Hitchcock likes to play games with his audiences, right? Even his plots are kind of these wind-up toys that have twists and turns, and they're carefully calibrated to give you exact pieces of information at exactly the right moment that you're supposed to get them, right? Like, that's the whole point for him, is that Hitchcock is a very cognizant filmmaker of his craft and what it is he's actually doing. So yes, he is like venturing off into crazy land here, but Hitchcock himself is sort of leading him down that path, right? Based on not only our understanding of Hitchcock, but also how Hitchcock presents himself in his films and as a public persona, right? Even by the early 1950s, Hitchcock was sort of like a celebrity director, which there were not that many of in the studio system. So yes, he goes into crazy land. And I agree with you. Like, this is, as he says, too close reading, right? What are some of the potential benefits of that too close analysis, however, right? Like, even if you don't buy everything, what are some things we can still get out of this mode of looking at a film? Or do you have other thoughts on the other parts of this?
If Hitchcock's goal is for you to watch his film more than multiple times, then his appearances kind of causes that discontinuity that takes you out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you miss actions that are critical to the story by you searching for his appearance or co-appearance or whatever.
Right. So, right, like part of this is also like it creates a disjuncture, which then allows you to start to notice these things, right? So almost like saying that Hitchcock wants you to notice that there is this break in continuity for the story, so that you're watching his movies in a completely different way than you otherwise would, right? Do you buy this? Anybody?
Well, I know that. So I guess Hitchcock, I feel like I always think of like filmmakers as there's kind of the filmmakers who want you to be really lost in the movie and not realize you're in a movie. And there's filmmakers who want you to be painfully aware that you're watching a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And he's definitely one of those. And I don't really like have a preference between those two types of filmmakers or films, but I do think it's interesting, especially if you want people to be aware that they're watching a film, how you do that. So like whether it's his cameos or his like almost like redundant image, especially in Strangers on a Train, like, you know, and then it begs the question of like why don't these characters recognize him? What is he trying to do? So it's interesting. It definitely like is eye-catching.
Yeah, and it does, you're right to point out, like, there are two different types of filmmakers in these modes. Ones who really want you to get caught up in the story, which I think Hitchcock also wants you to do, right? Like, there's a reason that his films are so carefully plotted with interesting characters to try and drag you through it, right? Francois Truffaut, right after the war, when they re-released all of Hitch's movies in France, and he would go to the cinema all the time, he famously said that he would go see The Lady Vanishes, which is another Hitchcock train movie, a very good one. He would go see The Lady Vanishes 2 or 3 times a week when it was playing, just to try and figure out how the plot worked, right? To break it down and analyze it. But he could never do it because he would just get caught up in like how well made it was, and it would just completely take him out of his own analytical abilities, right? So yes, Hitch, I think, is operating on both levels, and what D.A. Miller's piece kind of points at is there's a way to think about how the film might be doing both things, and one of them might be fruitful and one of them might not be fruitful. But that if we start to think about films as constructions, and in the case of someone like Hitchcock or even Christopher Nolan, right, to bring it up to modern times, if we can think about them as puzzles rather than narratives, what does that start to do for us as viewers, right? Can we derive different types of pleasures out of these films beyond just getting wrapped up in the storytelling? Okay. So all of that is to segue a little bit into our material for this week, okay, which is going to give us kind of the second half of what Miller is doing here. Okay, so how he's analyzing films has a lot to do with auteurism, but it also has a lot to do with semiotic analysis, right? The study of signs, as well as psychoanalytic theory, right? The pleasures that we get out of cinema, right? So hopefully everybody had a little bit of time to go and look at least the video that explains semiotics, the little like 5 or 6 minute with the very succinct woman who explains it. But the idea is just that, so in linguistic theory, right, the study of signs comes about by people trying to think through how we interpret and understand linguistic systems, all right? And there are 3 types of meaning that we take from everything: the iconic, the indexical, and the symbolic, right? Okay, so hopefully we're all just on board with that stuff, because I want to talk to you all a little bit about Wolin in particular here and how he's thinking about the cinema, okay? So for me, I think the big part of this in his chapter comes because he's writing sort of as a pushback on some of the things we've been reading so far, right? So if for Bazin, for example, right, like the indexical properties of photography are super important, right? He's pushing back on that. He's pushing back on Metz, who we'll get to in a little bit, who's really all about the symbolic meanings of signs in cinema, and saying like, what is most powerful in cinema? Here's the quote. In cinema, it's quite clear the indexical and iconic aspects are by far the most powerful. The aesthetic richness of the cinema springs from the fact that it comprises all 3 dimensions of the sign, right? And he goes on to say that one of the weaknesses of other theorists talking about this stuff, at least up to this point, is that they tend to elevate one dimension over another, rather than thinking about the system on the whole and our interpretive faculties for it, okay? And why is this important for Wolin, that we consider cinema's semiotic properties together as a system? Anybody want to take a crack at it? I want to start off also by saying like this theory this week is difficult to wrap your head through, okay? So don't worry about that. Just take whacks at it. I'm here with my notes to help you along.
So
yeah.
if we have iconic, indexical, and symbolic. I mean, I feel like they all, like, yes, they can all stand alone, but like together they all give each other more meaning if you have them all together, and therefore the more meaning you have, the more room you have for like an aesthetic and like creating style, symbols, if that makes right. Something
sure.
along those lines.
Sure, right? Like he's literally saying you can't actually understand any of these completely competently absent the other 2, right? Like what makes something symbolic or iconic or indexical is our understanding of it in relation to the other parts of the interpretation, right? So that if we're going to talk about iconography, which is another big thing for Wolin, which is not the same as iconic, right? But like iconography, sorry, I keep just like hiccuping on that word there. Iconography's power, right, comes a lot of the time from the combination of both iconic and symbolic elements, right? We see kind of the literal thing, but also we understand it as a purely symbolic object, something that we have a learned meaning of, right? What's an example of an iconographic object in Western culture, for example, or Western global South culture? There are lots of them, but like, what's a big one?
The bald eagle represents America, I guess, right?
Okay, that's one. Sure. Different birds in general have different iconographic meanings, right? If I show you guys, hold on one second, if I do this, what is that?
A cross.
Right. Okay. What is the symbolism of the cross? What do we derive from it if we see that show up in
Christianity?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Megan. I was talking over you.
Christianity.
Okay, and what about Christianity? What's the big thing in Christianity? What does the cross symbolize?
God.
Oh, God, yeah. But why the cross? Why do we care about the cross in Western culture, in Christianity?
Like Jesus died on the cross? Is that what you...
Yeah, which represents what?
Sacrifice?
Yeah, right? Some kind of noble sacrifice. Yeah, Kayla, I'll get to it. Give me 1 second, okay? I see your comment in the chat. Yeah, right? So we interpret the cross to have certain meanings when it shows up, right? So much so that I should have pulled this up to do this, but give me 1 second. I'm going to find. Give me 1 second. I'm just opening it so we can all see here. All right. So much so, does the cross represent something kind of like monolithic, right? It's this iconographic symbol, right? That even absent the cross itself, when we see this image out of Man of Steel with Superman, right? What do we get out of this?
So basically, they're using his body to be the symbol for the cross. And that's basically telling you how his character is, like how he's kind of like a god in a sense.
Okay. And also, literally, what's he doing for Earth?
He's like saving everybody.
And he's doing what with his body? He's putting it on the line, right? Potentially sacrificing himself to save humanity, right? Which is what Jesus did in the Bible, right? And it's drawing a direct one-to-one symbolic connection through that image, okay? Kayla, iconography, the easiest way I could think of it is like, it's not part of the 3-part breakdown. Iconography has to do with kind of like, like I said, it's kind of like a combination of symbolism and icon, right? Where we ascribe certain types of objects with some kind of monolithic interpretive understanding. And the reason that it's tied with the symbolic is that the meaning can be arbitrary, right? Like if you grow up in a Muslim country and you're not actually exposed that much to Christian iconography, right? The cross does not represent much, right? It's another way to think of it in a more perverse sense is, has anybody seen that episode of South Park where they're talking about racism in the Klan and they're burning crosses on people's lawns, but they keep referring to it as them lighting lowercase t's on fire and asking why they're lighting lowercase t's, right? That is like making a joke about like the lack of symbolism in that culture, right? Because of who the characters are. Okay, so that's what I think is the big difference there between iconography and just the iconic or symbolic sign. Okay. So what then can we do with all of this stuff? Well, we've started looking at Strangers on a Train, and kind of D.A. Miller certainly gets into the semiotic readings of relationships on the screen and how we interpret different signs, right? So like Hitchcock himself becomes multiple types of signs in Miller's analysis, right? But then if we're going to start thinking through like the pleasure of that, right? The pleasure of doing that analysis, we need to combine something else to it. And even though they're coming at this stuff from like completely different backgrounds, right? Like Wolin is coming out of linguistics. Beaudry and Metz are coming out of psychoanalytic psychology theory. Okay. Now, how familiar are we with psychoanalysis in general? I know we all have like popular understandings. What popular things do you know about psychoanalytic theory from Freud or Lacan? I know you have some, but what are they?
I didn't know anything. Right?
Okay. Well, that's fine. Have you heard of the Oedipal complex? You know the myth of Oedipus, right? So like, what's the story of Oedipus?
Isn't that so? It was like a prophecy that he was going to like kill his father and then marry his mother, and that happened.
Yes, right. And then he like gouges his eyes out, right, because of how terrible everything is, right, as penance. Okay, so in psychoanalytic theory, what does that come to like mean? What's another key component of the Oedipal complex that Freud would talk about? It's not just the desire to kill your father, right? But also what? It's okay, just say it out loud. We got to get comfortable with this because we're going to spend like 3 weeks here.
Was it attracted to the mother or something like that?
Yeah, right. The sexual attraction to the mother. Okay.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? According to Freudian Lacanian theory, it comes from when we're very young, right? When we're children.
Right.
Okay. And it's very important to note that Freudian psychoanalytic theory, which Lacan builds off of, is extremely phallocentric, right? Meaning that it's all about the male subject and the way that you think about the female subject, and you can also treat, right? Because psychoanalysis is therapy, right? It's talking out the issues that you have, the repressed memories, to kind of solve your mental issues, right? Your illnesses. The way you also think about women, right? Female, is in relation to that. So if you can figure out the male, you can figure out how to help women as well, because culturally, right, patriarchal phallocentrism is kind of this monolithic thing that we all live under. Okay, so we need to figure that out. All right, so far we've got, okay, Oedipal complex. Where does the mother come into things for children, according to Freud? Anybody know this one? So the idea is that when you're young, right, one of the ways that there are two things of this. We'll get to the mirror thing, which is very big for Beaudry and Metz, okay? Again, related to the mother in that phase. The idea is that at some point, while the ego, self-consciousness, is being formed, right? Your identity as you see yourself, right? That at some point you recognize your mother's difference, or for women, father's difference, right? By seeing them naked. And you, if you're a male, observe a lack. And that terrifies you because you have not seen yourself as different from your mother up to this point, right? Like most of the time, literally as a baby, you're actually attached to her, right? So you're literally one thing for most of your life, right? Up to this point. That subconsciously creates several strands of desire that govern our unconsciousness, right? So the things we don't even realize we have issues with, or how we construct our idea of self, we don't even know that that's what's happening. Okay, are we all on board so far with where we are? Okay, so this is the crux of it, right? That in observing the lack of the mother, the subject understands itself as a subject and also forms a desire to return to a moment in which it was a whole thing. Okay? Some of where Freud is getting this stuff is out of like Greek myth, right? So the object that like at one point there was one and then we became separated, and like love comes out of that, right? This whole mythological construct of like what oneness looks like, right? Because Freud is also interested in stories and cultural myth as a way to analyze and think through the hangups that we have. Okay. Okay. Questions so far about any of this? All right. So what this sets up for Beaudry and Metz, right, who are coming out of a philosophical psychological theory background, is we have the cinema, right? Film as something that people are very much into and seems to fulfill something for them, consciously, culturally, however you want to think through it. And they're trying to understand literally how that works, right? In psychoanalytic terms, which will allow us to then read films in combination with things like semiotic theory to interpret them. Okay? All right. So now that we have kind of just the basics of where they're coming from, let's take a step towards stupidly complex theoretical moments for both of them. Okay? So the biggest thing for Beaudry is something called apparatus theory, okay, where he conceptualizes the cinema, right, literally the whole process of it, right, from the camera to the projector to the darkened room to the screen to our presence within the room watching the screen, as something that mirrors our unconscious processes for desire. Okay? It's this huge complex theory that really boils down to the idea that what cinema does and how it works is it returns us to a stage kind of right before we form an ego, an understanding of self, so that we are comforted by it and don't recognize ourselves necessarily as part of it, but also identify with it, right? Like we did our mother, okay? This is where the mirror thing comes in, okay? So this is out of Lacanian theory predominantly. What happens during the mirror phase? It gets mentioned in both essays, so y'all should at least know the basics of what they say happens here. What is the mirror phase? So the mother and the infant are looking in the mirror. What happens?
Isn't that when the baby tries to identify with the mother?
And why can't it? What does
Um,
it recognize in the mirror?
gosh. Um,
You'll
it
get there.
recognizes that it's like they're like she has different features and stuff like that. And
And
it's like when the audience tries to identify with the main protagonist, like they're trying to identify with them so they can relate to like
okay,
their journey.
that's getting there. That's stepping just further than where we currently are, though. But yes, that's the basics of it. So the idea is that, right, if the infant up to this point has no ego, right, it doesn't recognize itself, okay, it doesn't understand itself as an individual. What happens during the mirror phase is that we, right, as babies, we know mother, right? We can always see mom, she's there. We grasp this, right? We don't recognize ourselves because we have no concept of us as a person, right? There's mom, there's other people, right, that we recognize as not mom, but they're not us. We don't recognize us in those people. When we see the mirror and we can recognize, right, that there's mom, who's this other person with mom, we start to form an understanding of our own identity as something that is present, right, in addition to mother. So it's no longer just recognizing mom, it's recognizing self, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Right? It's about the formulation of your ego, okay? At that point, right, we start to undergo various repressive techniques unconsciously, which cover up traumas, right? The idea here is that before any other thing happens to us, as soon as we understand that we are ourselves, we start to experience an isolation from the comfort of mom and thus have to repress the knowledge, right, that we're no longer part of that person. Okay? This is kind of the starting point of how they say the brain handles trauma and how it covers it up and how it keeps it repressed so that we can continue functioning in our daily lives. Okay? So, if we're thinking about, as Beaudry and Metz are, right? We'll keep with Beaudry here for a second because this is really his big thing. And we go into the cinema and we experience on the screen a film, right? Who do we identify with? We don't identify ourselves as the main characters, right? I mean, unless you're like, I'm Tom Cruise watching Tom Cruise, right? Although that gets complicated too, because he would also know that's not actually him anymore, right? He's sitting in the theater, right? So how then are we allowed to separate our knowledge of where we are in space and time, physically, mentally, with kind of the disjuncture of needing to identify with something on the screen in order to not constantly think about the fact that what we are watching is fully fabricated and be drawn out of the process. Okay? Right? It's the same thing that underpins like the idea in psychology of dreams, right? Like when you're inside of a dream, you don't recognize it as a dream, and as soon as you do, what happens? You're brought out of it, right? So Beaudry's thinking here of cinema sort of as like a dream machine that mirrors our mental processes, right? So that camera is eyes, right? Projector is kind of our unconscious, right? The screen, in some ways, is recognition. Us in the theater, right, is reversion to that earlier form of formation of ego, right? Where we're comforted by the cinema and we want the cinema to comfort us in some way, right? Does that make sense? That's the basics of apparatus theory, is that literally the apparatus of the cinema itself mirrors that psychological process that allows us to actually watch and enjoy it, because we're no longer thinking constantly about the actors or the cinematographer or the camera, right? We're sitting there and enjoying the movie as a piece. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So Metz takes this a little further and in a slightly different direction, because he goes beyond just talking about the mirror phase, right? So for both Beaudry and Metz really hammers this home, what happens for us as cinema viewers, right, is similar to what happens in the mirror phase, because we do not recognize, right, like what it is on the screen. And that creates a different subject-object identification, right? So we're not identifying with ourselves anymore. We're identifying either with the camera or with characters, right? But generally with the camera, right? We're not identifying with people because we know that we're not the people, right? So how do we think about it? Camera, all right? Now, because we're split into this kind of subject-object dichotomy, right? This also facilitates what for Metz is like a super important part of psychoanalytic theory as applied to cinema, the scopic regime. Okay, so what are the elements of scopophilia here, which is another Freudian psychoanalytic concept? What if somebody says that they have scopophilia, what does that mean? Where do they derive pleasure?
From like watching.
Yeah.
Hearing.
Right. And what does Metz say a lot of cinema facilitates for our scopophilic drive, right? We all have a pleasure of watching and observing, right? What does cinema facilitate for us by and large? It's a specific type of watching. Brittany's got down here pleasure from looking. Indeed. What's the pleasure from looking? Observing. There's a specific type he keeps going to. It starts with a V. Most of the time, people don't know you're looking at them if you're doing this.
I can't think of the word. I'm trying to think of it.
Voyeurism, right? Okay. What is important about the type of looking that a voyeur is doing? So they're deriving pleasure out of it, but if they're right up on the person, it's not, right? Like if you're right here looking at somebody, right? That's not voyeurism. What is voyeurism? What's a key component of it?
It's like they don't know they're being watched.
Yeah, the distance between them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's an observation from a distance, okay? This is him returning again to like why that mirror phase subject-object distancing is important, right? So that part of our pleasure from cinema comes from the fact that we don't identify with anybody on there. And in fact, we're observing and no one knows that we're observing, right? Like none of the characters on screen know that we're peeping Toms basically into their lives, right? So this fulfills that drive, that desire, that pleasure, and keeps us kind of enamored with the scopic regime of cinema, right? Okay. So we have here, right, a desire to look and observe, and we derive pleasure from looking and observing. And cinema fulfills these functions for us, okay? And because it fulfills these functions, right? It fulfills our desire to look and observe. And because we're doing it at a distance, this creates certain circumstances under which other types of psychoanalytic analysis can come into play, right? So, does anybody in class like watching horror films? Do you like the bloody, gory stuff? Okay. I'm really big into that stuff. Part of it is that I really like special effects, and I like seeing like teams really pull creative special effects off, right? Why do we get pleasure, however, from watching horror films?
For me, it's like if I don't scream, it's a problem. Like if you don't have me like at the edge of my seat, like what's gonna happen next, and then it's just like I just, and it got to do with the edits too, like how
Okay.
they, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Kayla Cohen.
So one of my favorite movies ever is Hereditary by Ari Aster. And I was like when I was finished watching it, I was so just like shaken up by it. But I was like, why do I like this movie so much? It's so messed up and so terrifying. And I guess it's just because like we hopefully will never be in situations like this, and so watching it from a distance is like this like mysterious factor of like, well, that won't be me, but like this is what it's like for someone to go through this sort of crazy supernatural, or just terrifying event. And maybe we just kind of, I don't know, the mystery of it really thrills us in a way.
What's another part of psychoanalytic theory that we haven't talked about yet? Does anybody know? It just kind of got mentioned in both of these comments.
Like consciousness of death and
the death drive, right? So in psychoanalytic theory, there's an idea that all humans have a desire for death, right? Ultimate, like just a completely subconscious, we don't acknowledge it drive, right? This is what causes people to do like, fun things for the thrill of it that are potentially deadly, like skydiving, whatever, right? But what allows us to actually step off the plane when we're skydiving, or allows us to get into a race car or onto a rickety roller coaster, right, is that we disavow the knowledge of our own potential mortality, right? This also goes back into like recognizing the mother's lack and the disavowal of difference and all that different stuff. We'll get more into that next week when we deal with feminist theory. But right, the idea here is that horror allows us to experience something from a distance, right, where that mode of pleasure that is subconsciously and unconsciously activated from like what Freud and Lacan call the death drive, right? It's activated, and that creates pleasure in us as viewers, right? Because we can experience something that is terrifying to us, but it's a safe way to do it. Okay. So you start to see how like some of these theories become widely applicable as we move forward in the 20th century into like full on film criticism and modern film theory, right? Right, like what this opens the doors for is like next week we'll be reading Laura Mulvey, okay? How does cinema set us up as a linguistic system and as one that functions in these like similar ways to psychoanalytic theory to observe women and female bodies in specific ways, right? And because we know that it works in both a semiotic analysis mode and a psychoanalytic mode, all of which derive from phallocentrism and patriarchal society functions, right? The reason that the cross is symbolic as opposed to like whorehouses is because Mary Magdalene is not the savior in the Bible, right? Right. So it's all this patriarchal imagery. Because all of this, we know that it sets us up to understand women in relation to the camera, our identification, in certain ways, right? Or once we get to like queer theory, how can queer audiences interpret and see themselves or understand their own desires in relation to something that is set up within these kind of narrow, patriarchal, cis-het confines, right? The same with critical race theory, right? A lot of what James Baldwin's book that we're going to read, so y'all should go ahead and start ordering that, or at least make plans to have it from online, because it's coming up quicker than we realize. But a whole part of James Baldwin's book is about what it means to be a gay Black man watching movies in which cis, het, patriarchal, white imagery is the dominant form of storytelling. And what does it mean as a Black gay man to be a fan of movies in that way, right? And what meaning can be derived from it, okay? So this is where all of this starts going. I mean, it's really an important part of the history of film theory. And I know that it's a whole lot that we did this week, but I think it's important just to have a grounding in it before we start moving to just where we get to, which is the fun, good stuff. Amisha, you had a question?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to give a suggestion if someone wanted to watch a movie that has to deal with like the queer theory. For my psychology class, my freshman year, we watched But I'm a Cheerleader.
Mm-hmm.
And it focuses on that. So if you want to try to watch that movie, it's a really great movie, and it will get you to understand that topic.
Yeah, no, But I'm a Cheerleader is really fun, and it's a good movie, like a really good movie. I did want to quickly, because we're closing in on the end of class, talk to you a little bit about Rear Window, which is a movie that does kind of explicitly all of the things we just talked about. Right. So as you were watching Rear Window, what were some of the big things you picked up on or found particularly interesting, tied into the reading or not? It's our film again for next week, so you can rewatch it if you're game for it. It's always fun to rewatch things in a different light, but you've already watched it, so you don't need to. But yeah. How'd y'all feel about Rear Window in relation to the topics we're kind of covering this week?
Well, basically, it just shows how he was watching from his perspective, and then versus they're just living and not even aware that he is paying attention to them.
Yeah. Here, I'm going to queue up just a couple of minutes here at the very beginning, right? Like, this is Hitchcock pretty explicitly cueing us into the fact of like where we're supposed to identify with, right? Oh, sorry. So, right. So here, like, it's pretty clear, like our subject position is literally that of the camera. Right. And when we see Jeff kind of take out his long lens camera, right. We'll talk more about that symbolic imagery next week when we're talking about feminist theory. But when he takes out that camera, right, and he's looking out the window and taking photos of Thorwald, right, and the murderer, right, like we're supposed to understand what it is we're identifying with. And feminist theory takes that a step further, like this is what you're supposed to be identifying with. right? One more little quick thing, because I know we're at time. I did want to show, just so we can see how often Hitchcock forces us to identify with the camera, right? Just this clip from Notorious, which is pretty famous. Okay. Okay, so hold on, let me stop sharing. Right, like even here, this is what Metz is talking about when he's talking about a scopophilic regime, right? Of how the cinema is constructed. It fulfills the desire to observe from a distance while also completely collapsing that desire to know exactly what's going on, right? So that the like that literal zoom into the close-up. Hitchcock is fully aware of psychoanalytic theory. Okay. I mean, Vertigo is a movie that is about psychoanalysis. It's got a plot and it's a mystery, but like it's a movie about psychoanalysis. Okay. The same is true for Psycho, right? Literally, Norman Bates wants to be with his mother, who's now dead because he killed her, and he goes around killing women as a substitute, right? Like there's all these sexual hangups in it, right? Sorry if I spoiled Psycho or Bates Motel for y'all, but it was made in 1960. Okay, look, I think y'all get it. If you have questions about anything, reach out. We'll pick this back up with Mulvey next week because it's all that. It will also be a slightly lighter workload. I mean, and yeah, anyway, we'll pick it back up with Mulvey. I'm going to send an email about the meetings in person, and I look forward to talking with all of y'all, okay? I'm going to stop recording.